if that's set all right. Does that sound comfortable to listen to? It must be an acoustic in the room because it sounds completely disembodied voice to me, which is a very peculiar sensation. Whistling. Is it whistling? Okay. As I said last week, anybody who's a long way back, I don't mind if people leave at any stage. So I'd rather people sat nearer to the images rather than further away, because it's all about looking at the images. So I'd encourage you to come forward, and it's sort of more of a conversational group, as close as you dare. It's the anxiety of the front row, which I share, but that's fine. Wherever you, yeah. Face to face. Ooh, it is a bit loud land, I think. Face to face. I always move the microphone and then Land thinks it's too far away. How's that? Can't hear a thing. That sounds all right. That sounds better to me. I'm representing an image of the Raeburn painting yet again, because it's where we started the series, and it remains a sort of motif in the pursuit of looking at paintings that somehow have a particular embodiment of stillness and a capacity of the medium to hold stillness, and what that might mean as an experience for a viewer. I'm not going to leave it there for long. I just want to revise one or two thoughts. As I've explained to everyone who was able to come, for the first week, this painting is much smaller than this. It's what's called a cabinet-sized full-length portrait, and it's just in relation to my own body. It's about this big, isn't it? It's about that big. Much smaller than you'd think it would be. And as such, it's a sort of consummate example of an early 19th century easel painting. It's a portable painting, and it would be, we can't see it, it's a framed painting. So its relationship to walls is subject to the possibility of change, and therefore its physical relationship, or the viewer's physical relationship to it, is subject to continuous possibilities of change too. And last week we concentrated not on a painting so much as a photograph of a painting, Jeff Wall's restoration, horizontal panoramic photograph of a 360-degree panorama, but what I tried to draw attention to was the state of self-containment or reverie that the principal figures in Wall's work seem to be experiencing, and that I think that they managed to convey to me as an experience. And we might take this particular image as a sort of hinging point between particular genres, but also particular physicalities of painting. And so clearly the spectacular scale of a 360-degree panorama contained in a cylindrical drum-like building, with the viewer adopting a central viewpoint, literally surrounded by painterly imagery, is of a completely different order to the notion of the easel painting. And yet, as if to stress still the significance of a sense of surface, Jeff Wall's restorers are, as we noted, establishing the actual plane of the painting above the apparent depth of the painting by the application of these restorers' tissues to the fabric of the damaged painting and the repair of it. And this theme of damage and repair is going to developed this afternoon as well. But the touching of this making of contact is something very much that I want to try and talk about in relation to Piero della Francesca this afternoon. In the discussion last week, we ranged a little bit around the representation of figures within these landscape spaces, and I drew attention in particular to the iconography of the figure turned away, of the figure appearing to pay complete disregard to the potential presence of another, and not, as it were, to acknowledge the actual presence of the living viewer. And we looked at this Friedrich, and we saw it extended into contemporary work by Cindy Sherman. We see it in Ingres' famous Valpinson bather. This is a later chalk and watercolor study of the painting in the Louvre. This is a very small drawing in the Fogg collection at Harvard. But nevertheless, it, I think, helps us to get a grip on this notion of the turning away of the figure, because we become, I think, a little more conscious of the fact that the viewer is given the sense of being involved in a sort of sensual realm which is completely other to the realm that the represented figure is involved in. And so, simply on a visual plane, for example, what we see, the bottom of the foot, the back of the head, are of course all those aspects of the body which, we, unless we involve ourselves with physical exertions and the uses of mirrors, are outside of the realm of our own visual perception. But it's a painting too that has been consciously carried into a contemporary realm. And this was achieved in this form, a painting by Gerhard Richter of his daughter, simply known as Betty. A painting derived, as all of Richter's figurative paintings are, from photographic origins. And we could talk actually for most of the hour just about this Ingres and this Richter painting. Norman Bryson points out in one of his texts that Ingres based his bather on a precedent by Raphael, in which we know that Ingres actually, consciously rotated a famous Raphael portrait of a turbaned figure. And the bather emerges out of that imagined rotation of a painted figure. We also know from Richter's notes that he was fully conscious of the relationship between this painting and the Ingres painting. So there is a sort of art historical leapfrogging going on between three images. But of course there are principal differences. Betty is involved in quite a different sort of torso twist, and it's inflected with a certain sense of an action actually happening, and that's my own mobile telephone going off, which I shall ignore it. It's I'll tell you what I know exactly what it is. It's a reconvened exam board at Bristol University, who I told if they wanted to telephone me for my advice as an external examiner not to telephone me after 5 o'clock. So that's, I shall note that. But apologies, because I can't stand it when mobiles go off. A very active kind of move, a sort of action of turning away. What I want to draw attention to in the two paintings, before we go to Piero, which we're about to do, is this little patch of white, this little rectangle of white in the lower right-hand corner of Betty. What this reveals, When I first encountered it, I had no idea what was this space that the figure was turning towards. And through this clue, I came to understand, and it's been confirmed, what it is. If you go to the new Gagosian Gallery in Britannia Street at King's Cross right now, a very beautiful show that I might try and talk about in part next week, a beautiful exhibition largely of paintings, abstract painting, has just opened, and it includes 3 very large monochrome grey paintings of Gerhard Richter's. And what Betty is doing is turning away from her father's camera. He's in the act of photographing him, and she's turning to look at one of his grey monochrome paintings on the wall. And this is a patch of wall, that's the edge of the painting. I like that discovery because it established the fact that Betty was face to face with an extremely shallow space, and also that she was face to face with another painting. And it does seem not too far-fetched to comment that the distinctive feature of the Valpinson bather, because this exact pose or poses incredibly related to it appear over and over again in Ingres. But this is the only one in which it appears in an extremely shallow, closed space. You know, this surface is not very far, we understand, I think, by eye, from where the figure seems to be seated. And the dominance of this reading of it as a sort of fabric space, I think, is also very interesting in that sense of establishing a surface that is very close to the depicted figure, but also quite close to the picture plane of the painting itself. All of this labouring is to try to draw attention to aspects of surface. And in pursuit of that, the intention of the afternoon really is to try to discuss Piero, not so much in relation to the iconography of the paintings, but, although we will in part, but to concentrate on their existence as frescoes, to concentrate on the distinctive fact of fresco that distinguishes it really from all other sort of media forms of painting. The fact that its pigment, that the body of the paint is actually in part and significantly absorbed into the physical fabric of a building. That the application of these paints to damp plaster, the action of which is for the damp plaster to suck the binding agents and pigments into the surface of the physical plaster itself, I think lends a charge to the presence of fresco, and hence all of this concentration on surfaces. So I hope we might get a little closer to the subject of fresco as we go on from here. Now, over here I've got some old slides. These I copied when I was trying to work out my response to seeing Piero's Madonna del Parto for the first time in Monterchi, and the unintended sort of recurrence of the question of restoration or conservation after Jeff Wall's restoration image of last week. Its recurrence is completely by chance, but my main encounters with Piero della Francesca's work have ended up being around moments of their conservation or restoration. And so there are 2 anecdotal encounters to share with you. One about the Madonna del Parto and one about the great cycle of the Legend of the True Cross in Arezzo, which is on the large screen. I think we'll just continue this for a moment, although in chronological terms I saw the Arezzo frescoes first. But when I went to Monterchi with a friend of mine to see the Madonna del Parto fresco for the first time, my imagination was full of an incredibly vivid account by the great art historian Kenneth Clark, whose book on Piero della Francesca is one of a number of works that I'd recommend to any of you who are interested to delve further into Piero's extraordinary art. Kenneth Clark describes going to Montecchi when it was still a relatively inaccessible small town. He describes the physical efforts of getting there, and when he gets there, he describes the difficulty of finding the key holder for a very small chapel in which the fresco existed. And he describes, you can just imagine the atmosphere of discovering the key holder in the village who takes him across the field, a completely solitary encounter of one person with a painting, and unlocking of the doors, and the doors of the small chapel opening, and sunlight flooding in, and the eye and light sort of encountering this extraordinary image of revelation of a figure all in one go. Quite memorable description. So as we were driving to Montecchi, I was thinking, I know there are going to be more people looking at it, but gosh, this chapel, and we arrived to find banners across the street of Montecchi saying, in Italian, "The miracle of the restoration of the Madonna del Parto," and a queue of people outside a small municipal building that turned out to be a disused school built in the 1940s. But still I thought, this is just where we have to buy a ticket or something, and then we'll go through the building and across a field, and instead of which did anybody else in this room see the work in this? You've seen it. I hope you'll tell me that I'm not exaggerating the shock of going into this building and seeing the detached fresco standing in the middle of a room with space all around it in a plexiglass box with brilliant halogen lighting illuminating it, and the soundtrack of religious song coming from an adjacent room where an audio-visual display tells the story of the miracle of the cleaning of the fresco. And it felt like a tragedy to me, and my heart sank, and I was filled with, the most, things like, it's vandalism, how can they do this? And I won't be distracted by the sort of distress of that, but I think everybody I know who's seen it there, it shares that sort of feeling. But I have to say, if you don't know this, I have recently read that the chapel from which it was detached, it is intended to be returned to that building in full, in due time. Anyway, the real point about this encounter is that within about 15 minutes of seeing a work that's meant to be a part of a wall that had always inhabited my imagination in this extremely vivid way, that within a matter of minutes the painting had completely captivated me, and it totally overwhelmed the appalling nature of its surroundings, and I was completely engrossed in it. And what you see is the Madonna, variously translated Madonna del Parto as the Madonna of birth, more prosaically the pregnant Madonna, Madonna of childbirth. She's standing in a tent lined with fur pelts, and there was a later piece of restoration to the roof of the tent which has been removed, which I think is a mistake actually, because you need to, we'll compare it to a panel in the Arezzo frescoes in a minute, but actually we'll compare it to this. It's the point of having two lots of images. This panel here, the Dream of Constantine, I'm sure you're familiar with this from the work itself or from reproductions, but Constantine sleeps in a tent with symmetrically opened curtains. But this rather elaborate and extravagant covering is being held apart by two angelic presences who are physically much smaller than the Madonna, and they are dressed in complementary tunics. They have red ochreish stockings and green stockings, ochreish gowns and green gowns, and green wings and pink wings and so on. Nothing too unconventional about this kind of thing, of course. But what is very, very riveting about the work is what happens when you try to engage, or when you find yourself engaged by the faces of these three figures. And the Madonna's face, on closer examination, can clearly be seen not to be focusing outwards from the painting, but slightly deflected, declining. But the gaze of the two angelic figures completely triangulates you as a viewer. When you're standing in front of this, you feel utterly looked upon by these two figures that act as wings to the Madonna herself. And of course, there is an entire iconography involved in this of the as it were, the exposure of the Virgin to the gaze at all. And so there is a complicated sense of feeling exactly where you are physically in front of these figures because of a sense of being triangulated, which, as you know, is a very precise form of locating something, and you are very definitely located, and therefore made self-conscious, I would say, self-conscious of the act of looking, particularly when the central object of attention appears not to be, as it were, involved in that outward look at all. What puzzled me as I looked at this, however, were these two arrangements of cloth. Piero's known for the verisimilitude of his kind of material treatments of the sheer naturalness of the hang of a heavy cloth, and I couldn't understand the weird sense of manipulation of these two shapes, especially when I realized that they were almost exactly symmetrical. You know, these convolutes which look random are actually mirror images of each other. And of course we can explain that by saying, well, in the process of fresco, which we'll talk about a little more in a minute, the use of a paper cartoon perforated with dots being literally turned over and mirrored for a symmetrical figures, completely usual practice. But the retaining of such seemingly informal, irregular folds seemed strange, and it caused me to do something that I've hardly ever done in front of a painting, which was to try and draw a part of it in order to understand its form a little bit more. And here we are. Oh, where's my drawings? Here we are. These are a couple of my just tiny little drawings, about 2 inches square, but there's some of the explorations, and as I worked my way around these folds and ripples, I realized that it reminded me incredibly of the ear of the Madonna in the painting. And that's a little drawing I made of the ear. And if we zoom backwards, sorry about this. I normally, when I've looked at these slides before, I've done it with 2 projectors, but here we are. Something that you notice very, very immediately in the encounter with the fresco is the extraordinary sort of bandaging of the head and the holding down of hair, this holding of it back and down. And there is this exquisite sort of slightly foreshortened ear presence. And I simply found myself thinking about a kind of chance resemblance between particular notions of anatomy and so on. But the first time I talked about these paintings, an artist called Caroline Russell, who was sitting in the audience, who had recently had her first child, said that she thought that something that she found in looking at these images that struck her very forcibly was to do with what she called from her own personal experience, a kind of interiorized acoustic of her experience of being pregnant. And she drew attention to this very touching presence of the Madonna, that the Madonna has of her hand upon her stomach. Because the notion of drawing attention in Piero, Piero drawing attention to an acoustic aspect of the subjects of his frescoes isn't at all unusual. The Nativity, here, familiar to all of us, sitting as it does in the National Gallery here in London, is often remarked upon at great length by historians because of its involvement in this attempt to represent so vividly, really, the experience of expelling sound, the playing of instruments, but also the vocalizing of sound. And although you can scarcely see it here, in the center of this panel is a braying ass, which has led more than a couple of art historians to speculate on Piero conducting a sort of critical approach, actually, to the iconography of the Nativity. Okay. Now, my second encounter with Piero, towards the late end of the 1980s, 1987, I think it was, I went to Arezzo for the first time with the sole intention, the only reason I went to Arezzo was to see the great cycle of the legend of the True Cross. And I arrived in Arezzo at about 4 o'clock in the afternoon or something. Incredibly hot day. And found my way to the church, entered into this wonderful dark, cool interior, full of, again, apprehensive excitement. And walked across to the, actually come in from this corner, frescoes are down there. So come in here, looked down the nave, poof, I couldn't see a thing. There was nothing down there except for hardboard panels, scaffolding towers, and those nets that scaffolding goes up with scaffolding, up and up and up, completely closing off the end of the church. And I paced down the middle of the aisle and I found a notice, small, quite discreet actually, that just said, the conservation and restoration of the frescoes has just begun. And the little door, workman's door was locked. And I stood looking at it and I couldn't believe it. It was another sort of extraordinary sensation of, have you ever had I had a bicycle stolen once, and I left it outside a shop. I didn't lock it up. I leaned it up on, with the pedal on the curbstone like you can, dashed into the shop to get something, turned round, and it wasn't there anymore, and it should have been, but it was as if there was a sort of vacuum or a void, a sort of hole in space had opened up. It was like that. They're not there. And I went to the attendants of the church, and I went to the inevitable shop, thinking that I'd have to sort of buy myself out of this despondency by getting as many books and postcards as possible. And everybody said it's impossible. The work has just begun, and the conservators are mapping the surface of the fresco. Nothing material is happening yet, but it is going to go on for years. And I went back into the church and I looked at this wall, and I realized that on the notice it had the address of, every Italian town has a superintendent of archaeology and art and culture, and and I thought, I have to try. So I booked myself into a hotel, waited for the weekend to pass, and at 9 o'clock on Monday morning I was there, and I said, I'm an artist. At the time I was teaching at Goldsmiths. I said, I teach at Goldsmiths College, London University. I thought I'd try anything. And they all looked very sort of, and rather politely I was told to just sit down for a few minutes. And then about 10 minutes later, a woman came up to me and she said, if you're at the door of the church at 11 o'clock this morning, a conservator will take you onto the scaffolding. Something beating hard. So I was there at 11 o'clock and I spent 1 hour with the conservator. He took me, wouldn't let me stop on the way up. He took me right up under the ceiling of the basilica, and then he brought me down layer by layer, by layer by layer. So I saw these works like that, literally face to face. And what we have the advantage of today, I'm glad to say, is that after I think in the end, all of the work, the mapping and then the fixing and the consolidating of the materials and the sort of groundbreaking adherence to new, it was all very sensitive at the time because of the furore surrounding the Sistine Chapel cleaning. All very carefully done, a sort of model project. And in the last few months, a book has been produced with the evidence of the restoration. It's the entire subject of one book. And so I can treat you to 1 or 2 images from this incredible book because the photographers were able to go up exactly to these levels and record these works face to face. And the distinction, the difference between one's encounter with them like that and one's encounter with them from the ground. I've since been back to Arezzo and seen them from the floor. The difference is very, very telling. So let's just walk through it. Quite interesting. For those of you that maybe haven't had the treat of going to Arezzo, these pages show you the complete array of Piero's principal panels that form 2 facing walls and 2 vertical side sets with a window in between. And you can get a sense, if you don't know the scale, when you realize the human scale is sort of here, so the works are very elevated. And one of the aspects, of course, of this particular type of application of fresco, which is simple but worth recalling, is that the elevation of the image, of course, takes it over the heads of other members of the congregation or tourists, depending. This interesting drawing shows each irregular shape on the wall represents 1 work day from the painting of the fresco. So each patch that you see in this irregular jigsaw would have been a separately applied layer of plaster for the day, painted during the course of the day, and then moved on from afterwards. And the sight of that, I think, is extremely interesting, just in terms of hanging on to a kind of schema in the confidence that it will resolve itself upon completion. It's quite an undertaking, this sort of piecemeal progress. This takes us a little closer into one of the panels, and the first thing I thought we'd look at in a little more detail is this panel, which is an Annunciation. It's again, in its iconography and proportions of its composition, a fairly conventional Christian Annunciation. And we're also going to look at the Dream of Constantine, as I said, here. But the particular cycle, as it's told here, begins in the top panel, which is a panel devoted to the death of Adam. I don't want us to necessarily become involved in the narrative of this, because that would be a different sort of talk, but essentially this particular account of the legend of the true cross involves the belief that when Adam eventually died at an incredible age, that a branch or shoot from the tree of knowledge, as it features in Genesis, from which the apple of knowledge was plucked, that a branch from this is placed in Adam's mouth when he was buried, and that a tree grew from this, and that the wood of the cross upon which Christ was crucified was taken from that tree. So this is the extraordinary narrative of this particular set of images. Quite extraordinary narrative when you think about it. So here already the camera has taken us up so that we can be parallel to the plane of the wall. But even here, we look across, and far from perfect, these pixelated, projected images, but nevertheless, we're going to look very closely at the heads of these two figures here and here. And it's thought now likely that the male figure on the left actually represents Hercules, which is a pre-Christian figure, was attributed with the capacity to rescue people from the underworld, from Hades. And this is the face of that male figure. Of course, greatly enlarged. One of the wonders of the book, and if you have the slightest interest in Piero, you have to rush out and get it. One of the wonders of the book is that on a number of pages there are physically actual size reproductions of parts of the painted surfaces, and so you have an extraordinary sense of the friability of these plaster surfaces. And of course, you can see very clearly the linear trace of dots from the application of the drawing, from the perforated cartoons. But the one tiny detail that I want to point out in this, you see this tiny dental presence, this little minuscule detail of a tooth. Just think about where that is. It's there. It's up there. This fantastic attention to detail. What you see when you examine these works, what I have had the good fortune to glimpse, and now everybody can get a sense of from the study of the conservation, is that Piero holds nothing back on account of distance. The sheer impossibility of being able to register the detail that exists in the paintings has not led, as it were, to a kind of simplification of the ensemble at all. The works are full of extraordinary details, and parallel to that, I can't detect, and I haven't read anybody who can detect, any account being taken of the effect of perspective on the viewpoint of the viewer on the floor looking up at these works. They are painted as if to be encountered, as it were, with a viewer who is parallel to the picture plane and whose feet are planted on a plane which is pretty much equivalent to the plane on which the feet are very firmly, and they usually are very firmly planted in Piero, within the represented space. And that fact, I think, is very fascinating if you ally it with the realization that Piero's two great treatises on perspective and foreshortening were unparalleled in their day, that his mathematics of perspective was a very major part of his creative endeavor, and there have been successive generations of historians who have not looked so warmly on Piero as we tend to today, who have attributed their criticisms to his preoccupation with mathematics. But for one so skilled in projection, he makes no use of any kind of design distortion in order to take account of the viewpoint of the viewer. And this is the look being returned. Extraordinary, isn't it? The sheer sort of subtlety of the application of colour too is so full of inflection and sheer subtlety. Now, quite down to the ground is the Dream of Constantine. This is the panel. In the narrative, Constantine is about to go out to battle the next day, and he's being visited by an angel who is swooping down above the pink roof of the tent, and the angel is said to be holding a cross of light. This is a famous figure, the foreshortening and radical viewpoint of the angel, whose head can't be seen. It's hidden behind the shoulder. There's a hand leading down, head behind, whole body, part of it lost, swooping upwards. And it's very unusual light for Piero della Francesca, because it involves clear highlights and deep shadows. Very, very different to the very even level of illumination which characterizes so much of the painting. This is the face of the attendant who is still awake, but unaware of the visitation. This is a detail of the newly cleaned sky above the tents. And if I had one of those laser pointers, I could point it out to you, but if you go straight up from this peak towards the top of the photograph, but slightly to the left, you'll see 4 stars in a square configuration. I don't know if you can make those out, which is, of course, is Ursa Major. So it's an observed sky, as it were, not simply an imagined or generic starry sky. It's a sky painted from observation. And this is a closer view of this strange, I think rather terrifying, painterly presence. This is another angel figure from the fresco, and I was fascinated when I saw this because I don't remember noticing this extremely abstract background treatment from looking at the frescoes themselves. Studying it over time in this book, I find this strange abstract distribution of double marks and blobs and lozenges, just like a brush, isn't it? Imagine loading a brush with paint and just laying the head of the brush on the surface and plonk. Anyway, it appears a number of times, and in some places it's clearly a wall surface and has the appearance of a kind of cut marble. But I know I'm sort of delighted by it visually, but I can't account for it as a representation of a known material. But it's such an active surface in the midst of the stasis of so much of Piero's studies. Now if we look briefly at the Annunciation down there, bottom right-hand panel, this is the figure of the Madonna at this visitation of Annunciation, and I think if we can manage it. And not an interesting thing to compare it to the Madonna del Parto figure in a number of aspects of its stature, of its orientation, of its and particularly this slight rotation of the head and the strong resemblance between faces. And here, of course, the completely known convention of the Madonna in the act of reading scriptures at the point of the arrival of the angel. And here, this extraordinary piece of painting, I think, of this transparent, diaphanous material over the head, extraordinary. And actually, I've not looked at these two side by side before, but one doesn't need to say too much. This one really. But look what's behind it. These are Piero's own studies. These are Piero's own drawings from his treatise on perspective. He established a particular method with a given number of points to be located around the head to enable it to be mapped as a three-dimensional object. And nowhere will you find this more beautifully elaborated than in Robin Evans' last book, The Projective Cast, which contains a complete chapter on Piero and Piero's perspectives, from which these reproductions are taken. What Bob did in that study really was to try to get to grips with not only with the mathematics of perspective, but also with the subjectivity of experience of looking at Piero della Francesca. And he draws a conclusion, or points towards a possible conclusion, which I think rings rather interestingly true. You know, it's often commented upon, if you, not only in Clarke, the other person to read, it seems very idiosyncratic writing to me now in large part, but Adrian Stokes' very unique and extraordinary writing about Piero, particularly in the second volume of his collected works, is rewarding reading. But what emerges over and over again is the sort of immobility of so many figures in Piero, but their capacity to move us emotionally. And what Bob Evans does is consider the demands that would be made upon a sitter, upon a subject being drawn or painted by Piero, in order for him to fulfill these methods. He had one method and something else he called the other method, and this is interesting in passing, because what Evans gets to grips with is complicating assumptions about perspective as a system, particularly of single point perspectives and vanishing points. And he discovers through a close study of Piero's so-called other method that these studies on how to rotate and foreshorten heads, for example, but equally lutes or horses, or that this involves a number of points, but it doesn't involve vanishing points at all. So it is a different system, and it's inserted into compositional arenas that are the result of single point, of vanishing point perspectives. And this resolves a lot of those formal anomalies that a lot of people have tussled with Piero. The fact that, you know, if that foot in perspective on that tile would have to be 2 feet long. It's impossible. Well, Evans points quite beautifully and simply to the fact that if the figure is from the other method, which doesn't involve a vanishing point, and it's inserted into a space which does involve a vanishing point, then there's going to be an anomaly between the two. But he goes further than that and suggests on this, accepting as we do the challenge of subjectivity in relation to such sort of systems, that perhaps the very demands of a sitter subjecting themselves to the stasis, literally standing or sitting so still to enable this plotting to take place, might bring about in the iconography itself a reflection of that staticness, that immobility. And I must say, it seems that there may be a lot to be said for that. The other thing Evans goes into, which I think is very interesting, is this array of 5 faces from the Arezzo paintings, and it has been assumed sometimes that it's the same head rotated and the result of one of these sorts of methods. He demonstrates quite simply by plotting some points that this isn't actually the case, that these little sort of triangular pyramid geometries would themselves have to be identical if that was the case, and they're not. So he suggests something else which I think is very nice, which is a sort of improvisatory adoption of that. Basically, he says, if Piero drew enough things by the other method, mathematically, by measurement, then he doesn't quite use these words, but he'd kind of get the hang of it through observation, and it's likely to be the case. But over and over again, of course, in the works, you find these beautiful resolutions of foreshortened details and the articulation of hands, all contained within this extraordinary cycle. Now, to conclude the last few minutes, just 5 minutes, I want to take a sideways step to a contemporary artist, Yannis Kourtelis. I mentioned last week, I think, that Kourtelis is currently exhibiting at Modern Art Oxford, an exhibition that I think everybody should see, a very major contemporary figure who has made a very serious and beautiful exhibition in Oxford. I didn't want to make this into a sort of mini lecture about the work of Yannis Kourtelis, so I've purposefully, if slightly perversely, not included a range of his maybe better known work in order to familiarize those of you who don't know his work with something about it. But suffice to say, if it arouses a little interest in you, you won't find it difficult to find out about Yannis Kourtelis' work. Yannis is Greek, he lives in Italy, and he has, since the 1960s, been a completely principal figure in what we came to be known as the Arte Povera group of artists. He's exhibited not infrequently in Britain, in group exhibitions, and also recently in a very, very good small private gallery called Spovieri, just off Regent Street. So there are lots of ways. If anybody wants to follow up things with me, I'll give you lots and lots of leads. But 3 years ago, Kourtelis was invited to remake a work that he had made originally in 1969, and it involves the tethering of live horses in a gallery space. And so there's another acoustic moment here, you see that? Yeah. Well, it's yawning or neighing, one or the other. So I'm not self-consciously trying to draw on the appearance of the abundance of horses in the Arezzo fresco, but there are many in turbulent battle scenes of sort of tumults, turmoils. But these two images are taken from the original making of the work, never titled Beyond Untitled, in 1969. As an artist, I'm only aware of one very grainy black and white photograph of that event. Very performative event, really. But nevertheless, that's the full picture, same photograph. Sorry about the printing grain. It's a very small reproduction. But nevertheless, for me, this was an iconic image. You know, I went to art school for the first time in the year that this work was made, and I've always had the feeling that it's one of those, a work that I've regarded as of considerable importance, combined with the realization that I could never ever experience it. And so it was an extraordinary moment 3 years ago when the Whitechapel Art Gallery, as a part of their program of inviting artists to re-present transient or performative works from the last 30 years or so, invited Cornelis. He'd been invited to represent it before, since 1969, and he'd done that once, but we know certainly that he'd turned down at least one approach because he didn't feel the space was right. But he did accept the invitation to do this at the Whitechapel Art Gallery. I apologize for the quality of this picture, although it was sent to me actually by the Whitechapel Art Gallery, but they don't have an archivist at the moment and can't get into their picture archive, so they only have this very low resolution picture. But you recognize the Whitechapel Art Gallery space from that photograph, and you can see there the horses. Tethered all around, Cornelis brought 12 horses into the space as he did in 1969, but for some spatial reason lowered the number to 11, took one out. We were on the pavement, actually, when the horses were led in from the horse boxes. Now, what's all this got to do with Piero della Francesca? More of these. Ooh. More iconography of horses. When asked about the priorities, the values involved in the work working, whatever we mean when we say we think something works, Cornelis replied that what was of utmost importance was how the horses were tethered to the walls. That this had to be authentic, real, strong, actual, not a sort of fudged approximation of some stabling device. They really had to be properly attached. Now, when you think about that, combined with another remark that he made, that it's about fresco, he said. Now, it seems to me, in a very incisive way, a way that's completely renewing, that's exactly what he meant about the fixing of the horse, the attachment of the horse to the wall. You know, everything we were saying, reminding ourselves of about the physical property of frescoes, the medium which is, as it were, absorbed into, literally drawn into the fabric of the wall. It's what Adrian Stokes, in one of his memorable phrases, he talks about fresco emerging at a time of new wall significance. Wall significance. And it's in that, I think, that the poetry of Cornelis' work often lies in that sort of direction, and I think it is a poetic of attachment to the wall. It wasn't a compositional matter, you know, he wasn't preoccupied by say, ooh, let's take the grey over here by the chestnut and let's bring the bay over here, because, you know, it wasn't thinking like George Stubbs. This is a completely different sort of proposition with these extraordinary live animals. And I hadn't thought of this, but in counter to my opening sort of anecdotes about coming across Piero at moments of crisis when when you couldn't actually see the works, or it seemed their conditions were so transformed that you couldn't actually see the works. For me, the experience of seeing this after nearly 30 years of knowing a black and white grainy photograph of a space that I couldn't ever enter, of a work that I couldn't inhabit or smell even, because it had a wonderful aroma to it. It was like walking into a work that you thought you'd never be able to experience, and I think I'll conclude the talk today there. Thank you very much. As always, I'd be delighted to have questions or try to respond to questions. So if anybody would like to pursue that, then please do. Well, I might turn this off, because then we'll all be speaking at the same volume.